There are moments in a woman's life when humiliation and heartbreak converge so completely that the world itself seems to narrow to a single, unbearable point of pain. And for Lady Eliza Ashford, that moment arrived on a crisp autumn evening in the glittering ballroom of Lord and Lady Pemberton's annual celebration, where the chandeliers cast their golden light upon 500 of London's most distinguished guests, and where she stood in her finest silk gown, her honey-brown hair arranged in careful curls, believing herself on the precipice of happiness. For 2 seasons, Lord Geoffrey Blackwood had courted her with poetry and promises, with whispered declarations in moonlit gardens and lingering glances across crowded rooms, and though Eliza was not a woman prone to romantic fancy, she had allowed herself to believe that his attentions were genuine, that his admiration for her conversation and her quiet understanding meant something true and lasting. She was not a great beauty in the classical sense, but she possessed what her mother called an elegant countenance, clear grey eyes that reflected intelligence and warmth, a graceful bearing that spoke of good breeding, and a gentleness of manner that drew people to confide in her. She had believed these qualities sufficient to capture Geoffrey's heart, and so when he requested a private word with her that evening, her pulse quickened with anticipation, her mind already composing the letter she would write to her mother, announcing her engagement. Instead, she found herself standing frozen as Geoffrey's voice carried across the space between them, informing her with careless cruelty that he had proposed that very afternoon to Miss Arabella Sinclair, whose father's shipping fortune could purchase a dozen estates and whose dowry exceeded anything the modest Ashford family could dream of providing. "Surely you understood," he said, his handsome face arranged in an expression of condescending sympathy that made her stomach turn, "that a man in my position requires certain practical considerations. You have been a delightful companion these past months, Eliza. Truly you have. But companionship does not pay debts or restore crumbling manor houses." She could not speak, could not move, could only stand there as the weight of realization pressed down upon her. She had been nothing more than pleasant entertainment, a way to pass the time while he awaited a worthier prize. The whispers began almost immediately, spreading through the ballroom like poison through water, and Eliza felt the eyes of society upon her as she made her way toward the doors, her head held high through sheer force of will, her heart shattering with each measured step. By morning, all of London would know that Lady Eliza Ashford had been passed over, discarded like last season's fashion, and though she told herself that dignity would be her armor, she could not stop the tears that fell in the darkness of her carriage as it bore her away from the life she had imagined and into an uncertain future, where love seemed nothing more than a beautiful lie, told to foolish women who dared hope. 3 months had passed since that dreadful evening, and Eliza had retreated to Thornwood Manor, her family's modest country estate in Hertfordshire, where the rolling green hills and quiet lanes offered sanctuary from the cruel whispers of London society. She spent her days walking the familiar paths of her childhood, tending to the small garden her mother had planted years ago, and reading in the window seat of the library where the afternoon light fell soft and golden across the worn pages of her books. The sharp edges of her humiliation had dulled somewhat, settling into a quieter ache that she carried with her like a stone in her pocket, always present, always weighing. She had ceased to weep, had ceased to rage against the injustice of it all, and had instead wrapped herself in a cloak of resigned acceptance that her mother found deeply troubling. Lady Catherine Ashford watched her daughter with worried eyes, noting how Eliza no longer spoke of the future, no longer dreamed aloud of children or a home of her own, and seemed instead to be preparing herself for a life of quiet invisibility. The household itself reflected their precarious circumstances. The drawing-room curtains were faded from too many summers of sun. The staff had been reduced to a cook, a maid, and an aging butler, and there were rooms that remained closed because they could not afford to heat them. Eliza's father, Sir Edmund Ashford, had taken to his bed with increasing frequency, his health declining in ways that the local physician could not fully explain, but that everyone understood had been hastened by worry over debts and the future of his only child. Without a suitable match, Eliza faced the grim prospect of becoming a spinster dependent on the charity of distant cousins, the Blackwood relations in Suffolk, who had made it clear that any assistance would come with expectations of servitude dressed as gratitude. She had accepted this future, or at least she told herself she had, for what was the alternative but to hope again and be destroyed again by the false promises of men who saw women as nothing more than ornaments or stepping stones to fortune. Love, she had concluded, was a fiction invented by poets to sell books and by men to secure what they wanted from women foolish enough to believe in pretty words. Security, stability, protection from want. These were the things that mattered, the things that could be relied upon, and if she could secure them through any practical means, she would do so without the dangerous distraction of romantic feeling. It was on a grey Tuesday afternoon, as autumn rain streaked the window panes, and Eliza sat with her mother over cold tea, that the butler entered with news that made her mother's teacup rattle in its saucer. A letter had arrived, and a visitor was expected within the week. The Duke of Ashworth, one of the most powerful and wealthy men in all of England, had written to request an audience with Sir Edmund on a matter of considerable importance, and though no one could fathom what business such a man might have with their modest family, the name alone was enough to set the entire household into anxious speculation about what possible interest a duke could have in the Ashfords of Thornwood Manor. The Duke of Ashworth arrived on a Thursday morning when the autumn mist still clung to the hedgerows and the pale sun struggled to penetrate the clouds that hung low over Thornwood Manor, and Eliza watched his approach from the window of her bedchamber with a feeling of dread mingled with reluctant curiosity, for she had heard much of this man but never before laid eyes upon him. His carriage was magnificent, black lacquered wood with gold trim and matched horses of deepest ebony, and when he emerged from within, she understood immediately why society had bestowed upon him the name the Stone Duke, for he moved with the deliberate precision of a man who had never known uncertainty, his tall frame impeccably clad in dark wool, his features arranged in an expression of absolute composure that revealed nothing of his thoughts or intentions. He was perhaps 35, with hair as black as a raven's wing swept back from a face that might have been carved from marble-high cheekbones, a strong jaw, a mouth that seemed unaccustomed to smiling, and when he lifted his gaze toward the house, Eliza stepped back from the window instinctively, though she could not have said whether it was his cold grey eyes or the sheer force of his presence that unsettled her so completely. The household had been in chaos since the letter arrived, her mother directing the servants in frantic preparations despite their limited resources, her father rising from his sickbed to receive their distinguished visitor in the best drawing-room, and Eliza herself had been instructed to dress in her finest day gown, a soft blue muslin that brought out the grey of her eyes, though she could not imagine why a duke would have any interest in examining the daughter of a minor baronet. The meeting between the Duke and her father lasted nearly 2 hours, during which Eliza paced the upstairs corridor and tried to convince herself that whatever business had brought such a man to their door could have nothing to do with her, until at last the butler appeared to summon her to the drawing-room, and she descended the stairs with her heart pounding against her ribs like a bird desperate to escape its cage. The Duke rose when she entered, a courtesy she had not expected, and she felt the full weight of his attention settle upon her as she curtsied and took the seat her father indicated, her hands folded tightly in her lap to hide their trembling. "Lady Eliza," he said, and his voice was deep and measured, devoid of warmth but not unkind. "I shall speak plainly, for I am not a man given to excessive preamble. I am in need of a wife, a woman of good family, good character, and sufficient intelligence to manage a great household. You are in need of security and protection from circumstances that would otherwise diminish your comfort and standing. I am proposing an arrangement that would benefit us both." She stared at him, unable to form words, and in the silence that followed, she understood that she stood at a crossroads, one path leading to the cold safety of a loveless marriage with the most powerful man she had ever encountered, the other leading back to the slow diminishment of poverty and dependence, and though every romantic notion she had once cherished cried out against such a calculated union, the practical part of her soul whispered that safety without love might be preferable to love that destroyed, and she found she did not know how to answer. The Duke had requested a private audience with her before his departure, and Eliza found herself seated across from him in her father's study, the door left properly ajar for propriety's sake, though she suspected a man of his consequence cared little for such conventions when they did not suit his purposes. He sat in the worn leather chair that had been her father's favorite, before illness confined him largely to his chambers, and she noticed that he did not seem to judge the shabby furnishings or the threadbare carpet beneath his immaculately polished boots. His grey eyes remained fixed upon her face with an intensity that made her want to look away, though she forced herself to hold his gaze with what dignity she could muster. "You have questions," he said, and it was not a question itself but a statement of fact, an acknowledgement that any woman of sense would require more information before binding herself for life to a virtual stranger. "I have many, Your Grace," she admitted, her voice steadier than she had expected, "though I confess I hardly know where to begin, for this is not how I imagined such a conversation would ever occur." Something flickered in his expression, not quite amusement, but perhaps its distant cousin, and he inclined his head slightly. "Then permit me to anticipate them. I am not a warm man, Lady Eliza. I do not offer you protestations of affection or promises of romantic devotion. What I offer is this: you will want for nothing material. You will be treated with respect in my home and in society. You will have freedom to pursue your interests and manage your household as you see fit. I will not be a cruel husband, nor an unfaithful one. I expect in return a competent duchess, a gracious hostess, and in time, God willing, an heir." He paused, and she saw something shift almost imperceptibly in his countenance, a softening so slight she might have imagined it. "I will protect you, Lady Eliza, from want, from hardship, from anyone who would seek to harm or humiliate you. This I swear." She did not know why those particular words struck her so deeply, perhaps because protection was what she had most lacked when Geoffrey had exposed her to ridicule, when society had whispered, and no one had defended her, but she felt tears prick at her eyes and blinked them back furiously, unwilling to show such weakness before this formidable man. "Why me, Your Grace?" she asked, the question escaping before she could consider its impertinence. "There must be dozens of women better suited to be a duchess, wealthier, more connected, more accomplished." His gaze did not waver. "I have my reasons, which I am not prepared to elaborate upon at present. Suffice it to say that I have observed enough of your character to believe you will suit admirably, and I am not a man who makes decisions lightly." She thought of her father coughing in his sickbed, of her mother's worn hands and worried eyes, of the Suffolk cousins and their conditional charity, and she thought, too, of the broken pieces of her heart that she had carefully swept into a corner of her soul where they could not cut her further. Love was a luxury she could no longer afford to believe in, but safety was tangible, real, something she could hold on to when dreams had proved themselves hollow. "Then I accept, Your Grace," she said quietly, and watched as something that might have been satisfaction settled across his austere features. Her mother wept with relief when told. Her father clasped her hand with trembling fingers and blessed the match, and by the time the Duke's carriage disappeared down the lane, Eliza had sealed away the last of her girlish hopes and resolved to be the best duchess she could be, expecting nothing from her marriage but the security she had been promised. The wedding took place on a grey November morning in the chapel at Ashworth Hall, and Eliza moved through the ceremony as though watching herself from a great distance, her voice steady as she spoke the vows that would bind her forever to the man who stood beside her with the same impassive expression he might have worn while reviewing estate accounts or conducting parliamentary business. The chapel was magnificent, ancient stone walls adorned with the banners of his ancestors, candlelight flickering against stained glass windows that depicted saints and martyrs in attitudes of divine suffering, and she thought it fitting somehow that she should pledge her future in a place designed to commemorate sacrifice rather than joy. Her mother wept in the front pew, though whether from happiness or sorrow Eliza could not determine, and her father had made the journey despite his physician's protests, his thin face proud as he watched his daughter become a duchess. The Duke, her husband now, she reminded herself, testing the word in her mind like a tongue, probing a sore tooth, placed the ring upon her finger with steady hands, and when the vicar pronounced them wed, he pressed a kiss to her forehead that was brief and correct and utterly devoid of passion. The wedding breakfast that followed was attended by what seemed like half the aristocracy of England, faces she did not recognize, offering congratulations she did not believe, and she smiled until her cheeks ached and accepted their false warmth with the grace her mother had spent years cultivating in her. By evening, the guests had departed, and she found herself alone in the Duchess's chambers, a vast suite of rooms decorated in pale blue silk and furnished with pieces that likely cost more than her family's entire estate, feeling very much like a child who had wandered into a palace and been mistaken for someone of consequence. Ashworth Hall was everything her modest childhood home was not, grand and ancient and immaculately maintained, with corridors that seemed to stretch into infinity, and servants who appeared silently to anticipate needs she had not yet recognized in herself. The Duke had been courteous at dinner, inquiring after her comfort and ensuring she had everything she required. But when the meal concluded, he had escorted her to her chambers, wished her a peaceful night's rest, and retired to his own apartments without any suggestion that their wedding night might include the intimacies she had both dreaded and, she was ashamed to admit, wondered about with a curiosity she could not quite suppress. She should have felt relieved. She did feel relieved, she told herself firmly, and yet as she wandered through her new rooms, trailing her fingers across velvet draperies and examining porcelain figurines that probably cost more than her dowry, she could not shake a sense of profound isolation, as though she had been set adrift on a beautiful ship with no knowledge of navigation and no sight of shore. It was only when she prepared to retire that she noticed it. A book resting on her bedside table, its leather binding worn soft, with use a volume of poetry she had mentioned admiring once. Briefly, during their single private conversation at Thornwood Manor, and she stood holding it in trembling hands for a long moment, wondering what it meant that he had remembered, wondering what it meant that he had thought to place it where she would find it, wondering if perhaps she understood even less about her husband than she had imagined. The days that followed her arrival at Ashworth Hall settled into a rhythm that Eliza had not anticipated, a quiet pattern of meals and duties and long hours spent learning the intricacies of a household far grander than any she had ever imagined, managing, and though she had expected to feel like an intruder in this vast and ancient place, she found instead that the work itself provided a welcome distraction from the peculiar loneliness of her new position. The staff had regarded her with barely concealed suspicion at first. Mrs. Pemberton, the elderly housekeeper, who had served the Blackwell family for nearly 40 years, watched her with sharp eyes that seemed to catalogue every word and gesture, while the footmen exchanged glances she was not meant to see, and the kitchen maids fell silent whenever she entered their domain. But Eliza had learned long ago that kindness was a currency that spent well in any household, and she applied herself to winning their trust with the same quiet determination she had once applied to her studies and her music. She learned their names, inquired after their families, praised their work with genuine appreciation rather than condescending acknowledgement, and slowly, almost imperceptibly, the atmosphere began to thaw around her until Mrs. Pemberton's suspicious glances softened into something approaching approval, and the kitchen maids began to smile when she complimented their pastries. Her husband remained an enigma, a figure she observed more than she knew, glimpsed across breakfast tables and in passing corridors, always immaculately dressed, always in motion towards some duty or responsibility that seemed to consume every waking hour. He rose before dawn and retired late, his study lamp burning long into the night as he attended to correspondence and estate matters and the parliamentary business that kept him frequently in London, and yet she noticed things about him in these stolen observations that did not align with his fearsome reputation, the way he spoke to Mrs. Pemberton with a gentle respect that bordered on affection, calling her by her Christian name when he thought no one was listening, the patience he showed young Thomas, the stable boy with the stammer, never once interrupting or showing impatience as the child struggled to report on the horses, the careful way he inquired after the health of servants' family members, remembering details that a man of his position might reasonably be expected to ignore entirely. These small contradictions lodged themselves in her mind like splinters she could not quite remove, fragments of evidence that suggested the Stone Duke might be constructed of something rather more yielding than his sobriquet implied. It was nearly a fortnight after their wedding when he surprised her by joining her for dinner rather than taking his meal in his study, as had become his habit, and more surprising still was the question he posed as the first course was cleared away, his grey eyes regarding her across the candle-lit expanse of polished mahogany with what appeared to be genuine interest. "Tell me, what occupies your thoughts when you are not attending to household matters? What pursuits bring you pleasure?" And Eliza, who had expected nothing from this marriage but cold civility, found herself speaking of books and music and the gardens she had loved at Thornwood Manor, and found too that he listened, truly listened, with an attention that made her feel, for the first time since her arrival, that she might be something more to him than a convenient solution to a practical problem. The invitation came on a morning when winter had at last begun to loosen its grip upon the countryside, pale sunlight streaming through the windows of the breakfast room as the Duke looked up from his correspondence and suggested, in that measured tone she had come to recognize as his manner of concealing any sentiment he deemed too revealing, that she might perhaps enjoy a walk through the gardens if she found herself at leisure. And Eliza, surprised by the offer, and more surprised still by the small flutter of anticipation it provoked in her chest, agreed with what she hoped was appropriate composure rather than unseemly eagerness. They walked in silence at first, following the gravel paths that wound through the formal gardens, where early crocuses were beginning to push through the dark earth, and the skeletal branches of rose bushes showed the first promising swellings of spring buds, and Eliza found herself acutely aware of his presence beside her, the measured cadence of his footsteps, the way he shortened his naturally long stride to match her pace, the occasional sideways glance he cast in her direction, as though checking that she was comfortable, that she was warm enough, that she had not regretted accepting his invitation. It was he who broke the silence, speaking of the gardens as they had been in his mother's time, how she had planted the roses herself and spent hours among them, despite the protestations of the gardeners who felt such labor beneath a duchess, and something in his voice, a softening, a vulnerability she had never heard before, made Eliza understand that he was offering her something precious, a glimpse behind the stone walls he had constructed around himself. She asked about his mother then, gently, and he told her, dead when he was 7 years old, leaving him alone with a father who believed emotion was weakness and affection was indulgence, a father who had methodically stripped away every tender feeling until his son learned to present the same impenetrable facade to the world that was expected of a Blackwell heir. I learned early, he said, his grey eyes fixed on some distant point beyond the garden walls, that to show feeling was to invite its use as a weapon against you, and Eliza felt her heart constrict with a sorrow she had not expected to feel for this powerful, seemingly invulnerable man. Perhaps it was his unexpected openness that prompted her own confession, or perhaps it was simply that the wounds Geoffrey had inflicted still festered beneath her carefully maintained composure. But when the Duke turned the conversation toward her, asking, with a gentleness that seemed almost foreign to his stern features, what had transpired with Lord Blackwood, she found herself telling him everything. The 2 seasons of courtship, the whispered promises, the growing certainty that she had found her future, and then the devastating public announcement that had revealed every tender moment as performance, every sweet word as manipulation, every hope as foolish naivety. She watched his face as she spoke and saw the transformation there, the tightening of his jaw, the dangerous narrowing of his eyes, the way his hands clenched briefly at his sides before he forced them to relax, and though he said nothing, merely nodding once when she finished, as though filing away information for future consideration, she understood in that moment that something in him had responded to her pain with an intensity that went beyond mere husbandly duty. They turned back toward the house as the clouds began to gather overhead, and as the first cold drops of rain began to fall, he offered her his arm, not perfunctorily, not as social obligation demanded, but with a deliberateness that made the gesture feel almost intimate, and when she placed her hand upon his sleeve and felt the solid warmth of him beneath the fine wool of his coat, Eliza thought that perhaps the walls between them had grown just slightly less insurmountable than they had seemed before. The weeks that followed seemed to transform Ashworth Hall in ways both subtle and profound, for as Eliza grew into her role as Duchess, the great house itself appeared to soften around her, its cavernous rooms feeling less like monuments to ancient grandeur and more like spaces that might, with time and care, become something resembling a home. She applied herself to the management of the household with the same quiet diligence she had once brought to her studies, reviewing accounts with Mrs. Pemberton, consulting with the cook on menus, ensuring that the servants' quarters were comfortable and their needs attended to, and in doing so she discovered a competence within herself that she had never had occasion to exercise at her family's modest estate, a capacity for organization and gentle authority that seemed to surprise even her. The staff, who had watched her with such careful scrutiny in those first uncertain days, now sought her opinion and welcomed her presence, and she heard through the reliable network of household gossip that they spoke of her with genuine warmth, calling her kind and fair, and nothing at all like what they had feared when they learned their master was to marry. It was the Duke's reaction to her growing confidence that surprised her most, for she had expected him to remain indifferent to the domestic affairs he had hired her, in essence, to manage, Yet she found him watching her at unexpected moments, observing as she resolved a dispute between two housemaids with diplomatic grace, noting when she remembered to inquire after the head gardener's ailing wife, and occasionally, so rarely that she might have imagined it, offering words of approval that she treasured far more than she wished to admit. "You have brought something to this house that it has lacked for many years," he told her one evening over dinner, his grey eyes holding hers across the candlelit table. And though he did not elaborate on what that something might be, she felt the warmth of the compliment settle into her chest like a small flame, carefully kindled. Their dinners together had become a ritual now, no longer awkward silences punctuated by stilted conversation, but something approaching genuine companionship. And she discovered in these evening hours a side of her husband that society would never have believed existed, a dry, subtle wit that emerged in unexpected observations, a breadth of knowledge that ranged from philosophy to agriculture to the Gothic novels he confessed to reading in secret, a capacity for listening that made her feel, for perhaps the first time in her life, that her thoughts and opinions held genuine value. When he learned that she played the pianoforte, mentioned in passing during one of their increasingly comfortable conversations, she thought nothing of it until 3 days later, when she entered the music room to find a magnificent instrument being positioned by a team of carefully supervised workmen, its polished rosewood gleaming in the afternoon light. And when she turned to find her husband standing in the doorway watching her reaction with studied nonchalance, he merely shrugged and said, "The music room required a proper instrument. The old one was inadequate," as though the gesture meant nothing at all, as though he had not remembered a small detail she had barely emphasized and acted upon it with characteristic thoroughness. That night, lying alone in her chambers with the memory of his almost smile, when she had played for him after dinner, Eliza acknowledged a truth that both thrilled and terrified her. She had begun to look forward to his company with an eagerness that had nothing to do with duty or gratitude, and everything to do with the man himself. And she feared, oh, how she feared that she was beginning to read meaning into gestures that were perhaps nothing more than the courtesy of a man honoring his practical obligations to a practical wife. The announcement came without warning on an evening that had seemed, until that moment, no different from any other they had dined together, as had become their comfortable custom, conversation flowing easily between them, as candles flickered low in their silver holders, and Eliza had been silently marveling at how natural it felt to sit across from this man who had once seemed so forbidding, when the Duke set down his wine-glass with a deliberateness that drew her attention, and said, in that measured tone she had learned to recognize as his manner of introducing matters of significance, that they would be travelling to London at the end of the week to attend the Marchioness of Westbrook's ball. The words struck her with the force of a physical blow, her hand freezing halfway to her own glass as the implications cascaded through her mind. London, where she had fled in disgrace, a ball where whispers would follow her every step, society, which had watched her humiliation with barely concealed delight and would surely be eager to witness whether the Duchess of Ashworth had recovered any measure of dignity or remained the pitiful creature Lord Geoffrey Blackwood had so publicly discarded. She must have paled, must have revealed something of the terror that gripped her heart, for the Duke's grey eyes sharpened with that particular attentiveness she had come to recognize, and he said, more gently than she might have expected, that she need not fear she would not face them alone, and she would not face them unprepared. The days that followed passed in a blur of preparation that seemed designed to leave her no time for the anxiety that threatened to overwhelm her whenever she allowed herself to contemplate what awaited, for the Duke had summoned London's finest modiste to Ashworth Hall with instructions that the Duchess required a wardrobe befitting her station, and Eliza found herself measured and draped and consulted on silks and satins in colours she would never have dared choose. For herself, deep sapphire and rich burgundy, and a particular shade of silver grey that the modiste declared would complement her Grace's complexion magnificently. On the morning of their departure, a maid appeared at her door bearing a velvet case that Eliza opened with trembling fingers to reveal the Ashworth jewels, a parure of diamonds and sapphires that glittered like captured starlight, pieces she had seen only in the portrait of the Duke's mother that hung in the long gallery. And when she descended the stairs to find her husband waiting in the entrance hall, his eyes travelled over her with an expression she could not quite decipher before he said, simply, "My Duchess will outshine everyone present. They will see what I have always seen." The carriage ride to London was long, affording her too many hours to contemplate the ordeal ahead, but he seemed to sense her mounting distress and spoke to her of inconsequential things: the management of the northern estates, a promising new horse in the stables, a scientific lecture he thought she might find interesting, until the lights of London began to glitter through the carriage windows, and her hands clenched involuntarily in her lap. He covered them with his own then, warm and steady, and said quietly, "You have nothing to prove to them, but you will nonetheless." And when the carriage door opened and he handed her down before the blazing entrance of the Westbrook mansion, Eliza lifted her chin and placed her hand upon his arm and stepped forward into the glittering hell of her past, painfully aware that every eye in the crowded ballroom had turned to watch the Stone Duke and his unlikely Duchess make their entrance. The ballroom was a glittering sea of silk and candlelight, hundreds of tapers reflecting off crystal chandeliers to cast the assembled aristocracy in a golden glow that seemed designed to illuminate every flaw, every whisper, every sidelong glance directed at the Duchess of Ashworth as she moved through the crowd on her husband's arm, and Eliza felt each look like a physical touch, some curious, some admiring, but many carrying that particular quality of avid speculation that she remembered all too well from the night her heart had been shattered in a room very much like this one. She held her chin high and her spine straight, drawing upon reserves of dignity she had not known she possessed, and she felt the steady presence of the Duke beside her like an anchor in a storm-tossed sea, his hand covering hers where it rested on his arm, warm and sure, and silently communicating that she was not alone, would not be alone, that whatever came, she would face it with him beside her. They had barely completed one circuit of the room, pausing to acknowledge greetings from those eager to curry favour with the powerful Duke of Ashworth, when Eliza saw him, Lord Geoffrey Blackwood, as golden and handsome as ever, approaching with that confident smile she had once found so charming and now recognized as the mask of a shallow, mercenary soul. And on his arm walked a woman whose expensive gown and elaborate jewels could not disguise the pinched unhappiness around her mouth or the dull resignation in her eyes. The wealthy heiress he had chosen over Eliza, and what a bitter bargain that choice appeared to have purchased. "Your Grace," Geoffrey said, executing a bow that managed to convey insolence beneath its technical correctness, his eyes sliding over Eliza with an expression that made her skin crawl. "What a fortunate match you have made. The whole of society has marvelled at the Duke's charity in elevating one so overlooked." The words hung in the air like poison, and Eliza felt her cheeks flame even as she opened her mouth to deliver a response she had not yet formulated. But before any sound could escape her lips, the Duke moved, a subtle shift that placed him slightly before her, and when he spoke, his voice carried that particular quality of ice over steel that she had heard him employ with servants who displeased him, only magnified tenfold, concentrated into words that fell into the sudden silence like stones into still water. "Touch her and you die," the Duke said, each word distinct and unhurried and carrying absolute conviction, and his grey eyes held Geoffrey's with an intensity that drained the colour from the younger man's face. "Speak ill of her again to anyone, in any venue, and I will destroy everything you hold dear, every investment, every connection, every shred of the reputation you value so highly. Do not test me, Blackwood, for you will find I do not make idle threats." The silence that followed was absolute. Every nearby conversation suspended as the cream of London society witnessed the Stone Duke defending his Duchess with a ferocity none had ever seen him display, and Geoffrey Blackwood, his face ashen and his composure shattered, executed a jerky bow and retreated into the crowd with his miserable wife trailing behind him. The Duke turned to Eliza then, offering his hand with formal grace, and said in a voice that carried clearly to every straining ear, "I believe they are playing a waltz, and I find I wish to dance with my wife." And as he led her onto the floor and took her in his arms, Eliza heard the whispers begin anew around them, but they had transformed entirely, no longer pitying murmurs about the woman who had been passed over, but envious speculation about how the quiet Lady Eliza Ashford had captured the devotion of the most fearsome man in England. The carriage ride home passed in a silence that felt weighted with unspoken words. The London streets dark beyond the windows, the rhythmic clatter of hooves on cobblestones, the only sound, as Eliza sat across from her husband and tried to order the chaos of her thoughts, her heart still racing from what she had witnessed in that glittering ballroom. This man, This cold and fearsome duke, whom society called heartless, had defended her honor with a ferocity that had left her breathless and trembling and uncertain what any of it meant. When at last she found her voice, it emerged smaller than she intended, a quiet "thank you" that seemed wholly inadequate to express the magnitude of her gratitude, and she watched his face in the flickering lamplight as he turned those grey eyes upon her and said, with that dismissive tone she had learned to recognize as his way of deflecting anything that touched too close to genuine feeling, "Blackwood is beneath contempt. He deserved far worse than words." But she could not let it rest there, could not allow him to retreat behind his walls of indifference when something momentous had shifted between them in that ballroom, and so she pressed forward despite every instinct warning her to leave well enough alone. "You threatened to destroy him," she said, and her voice was steadier now, colored with something approaching wonder. "Before all of society, you declared yourself my protector, in terms that left no room for doubt. Why?" The question hung between them as the carriage swayed through the darkened streets, and she watched him struggle with himself, watched the play of shadow across his angular features as he looked away from her toward the window where nothing but night was visible. The silence stretched so long she thought he would not answer, that he would retreat into formality and leave her question unanswered. But then he spoke, and his voice was rougher than she had ever heard it, stripped of its usual controlled precision. "Because you deserve to be protected," he said, and his eyes met hers again with an intensity that stole her breath. "You always did." 4 words, 5, and yet they cracked something open in Eliza's chest, flooding her with emotions she had thought herself too wounded to ever feel again, and she found she could not speak, could only stare at him as the carriage carried them through the night, toward home, toward the estate she had come to love, toward a future she suddenly dared not examine too closely, for fear it might dissolve like morning mist. When they arrived at Ashworth Hall and he handed her down from the carriage, his fingers lingered on hers a moment longer than necessary, warm and strong and impossibly gentle, and when he walked her to the door of her chambers, as had become his custom, he paused there in the candle-lit corridor and raised her hand to his lips, pressing a kiss to her gloved knuckles that she felt like a brand even through the silk. "Good night, Eliza," he said, and her name in his mouth was a revelation, and then he was gone, disappearing down the corridor toward his own chambers, and she stood frozen in her doorway with her heart pounding against her ribs and hope unfurling in her chest like the most dangerous flower, for she had resolved to expect nothing from this marriage, had armored herself against disappointment, and yet here in the darkness she found herself lying awake for hours, staring at the canopy above her bed and wondering if she dared believe that the Stone Duke might feel something more than duty toward the wife he had married for convenience. The weeks that followed the ball unfurled like the petals of a flower opening to unexpected warmth, each day bringing some new small gesture from the Duke that accumulated in Eliza's heart like treasures she scarcely dared to count, and she found herself cataloguing them in the quiet hours before sleep the morning. He appeared at breakfast with a book of poetry he had ordered from London, because she had mentioned admiring the author. The afternoon, he cancelled his meetings to read aloud to her in the drawing-room when she confessed to a persistent headache, his voice low and steady and soothing as he worked through chapter after chapter until the pain behind her eyes finally eased. The evening she discovered that her favorite white roses had been planted beneath her window, so their fragrance might drift up to her chambers, though he claimed when she thanked him that the gardener had made the decision independently and he had merely approved the placement. Her favorite tea appeared at every service without her ever needing to request it. The particular blend of bergamot and lavender that she had drunk at her family home and mentioned once, just once, in passing conversation, and yet somehow the Duke had remembered, had arranged for it to be procured, had ensured it was always ready for her as though her smallest preferences were matters worthy of his attention and care. He began calling her Eliza in private, her given name in his deep voice, sending warmth spreading through her chest each time she heard it, and though in public he remained the formal, austere Duke of Ashworth, in their quiet evenings together she glimpsed more and more of the man beneath the title, his rare smiles that transformed his stern features, his dry observations about the foibles of society that made her laugh, the way his eyes softened when they rested upon her face as though she were something precious beyond measure. One evening she looked up from her embroidery to find him watching her with an expression she had never seen before, unguarded and almost reverent, his grey eyes holding something that made her breath catch and her heart stutter in her chest, and for a long moment neither of them moved, the air between them charged with unspoken possibility, until he seemed to catch himself and looked away, clearing his throat and returning his attention to his papers with studied casualness that did not quite conceal the faint colour rising along his cheekbones. Eliza bent her head over her needlework, but her hands trembled slightly, and the truth she had been avoiding could no longer be denied. She was falling in love with her husband, deeply and irrevocably, and terrifyingly in love with this man, who had offered her only respect and protection, never promising anything more, and she did not know if the tenderness she glimpsed in him was love, or merely the careful attention of an honourable man, fulfilling his duty to a wife he had chosen for practical reasons, and the uncertainty was exquisite torment. Hope and fear tangled together in her chest until she could scarcely breathe around them. The fever came without warning, transforming a mild autumn chill into something far more sinister within the span of a single night, and Eliza woke in the grey hours before dawn, with her body burning and her mind fogged with confusion, unable to do more than whisper for help before the darkness claimed her again. And when she surfaced once more, it was to find the household in quiet chaos around her. The physician, summoned from London with urgent haste, Mrs. Pemberton issuing orders in hushed tones, maids bringing cold compresses and fresh linens, but through it all, through the fragments of consciousness that came and went like waves upon a shore, she was aware of one constant presence, one anchor in the storm of her illness. The Duke, sitting vigil at her bedside with his hand wrapped around hers as though he could hold her to this world through sheer force of will. The staff whispered among themselves in the corridors, their voices carrying to her in snatches during her more lucid moments. They had never seen his grace like this, never witnessed such raw distress upon features that society believed incapable of feeling, and the elderly housekeeper was heard to murmur that the master had refused all food and would not be moved from her grace's side, despite the impropriety of a husband attending a sick room, despite the pressing business matters that awaited his attention, despite everything that duty and decorum demanded of a man of his station. For 3 days the fever raged, and for 3 days Alexander Blackwell, the Stone Duke, the most feared man in England, sat beside his wife's bed and held her hand and watched her face with an expression of naked terror that stripped away every pretense he had ever constructed. And when at last the fever broke, and Eliza opened her eyes to find weak sunlight streaming through her windows and the weight of his fingers still intertwined with her own, she saw something crack open in him at the sight of her returning consciousness, something vulnerable and desperately relieved that he could not quite conceal before she witnessed it. "You came back to me," he said, and his voice was hoarse, ravaged by sleeplessness and fear, and his hand tightened around hers with a tremor that shocked her more than any words could have. "I could not bear, I cannot." He stopped, his jaw working as he struggled against a lifetime of emotional suppression, and when he continued, his words were rough-edged and raw in a way she had never heard from him before. "The thought of losing you, Eliza, of this house without you, of my life without you in it, I found I could not breathe around the possibility." She was too weak to respond as she wished, too drained to find words adequate to the moment, but she turned her hand within his grasp and squeezed his fingers with what little strength remained to her, and she watched the moisture gather in those grey eyes that society swore were incapable of tears, and neither of them spoke of what this meant, neither dared to name the emotion that hung between them in the golden morning light. But when he leaned forward and pressed his lips to her forehead with infinite tenderness, lingering there as though drawing strength from the contact, his walls crumbled visibly, irrevocably, and she knew that whatever careful barriers had remained between them had been swept away by the tide of fear, leaving only the truth of two hearts that had found each other against all expectation and could no longer pretend otherwise. The days of her recovery passed in a haze of rest and strengthening broths and the gentle attention of the household staff. But beneath the quiet rhythm of convalescence, something had fundamentally shifted between Eliza and her husband, something neither of them acknowledged directly, but both felt with every glance, every accidental brush of fingers, every conversation that seemed to carry weight far beyond its words. And when at last she was pronounced fully recovered and permitted to resume her normal activities, she found that the world she returned to was not quite the same world she had left. The Duke watched her now with an intensity that made her skin warm and her pulse quicken. his grey eyes following her across rooms as though he could not bear to let her out of his sight, and yet, whenever she turned to meet his gaze, he would look away, a muscle ticking in his jaw as though he fought some internal battle that cost him dearly, and she began to feel that she was living within a storm that had not yet broken, the air heavy and charged with possibility, lightning flickering at the edges of every interaction, but never quite striking. He drew near to her constantly now, finding reasons to be in whatever room she occupied, standing close enough that she could feel the warmth radiating from his body, close enough that the scent of him, sandalwood, and something darker, something uniquely his, filled her senses and made it difficult to think clearly. And yet each time, the proximity seemed about to become something more. Each time she thought he might reach for her, he would pull back as though burned, excusing himself with abrupt formality that left her breathless and confused, and aching with a longing she scarcely understood. One evening in the library, the fire burning low, and the autumn rain pattering against the windows, their conversation wandered into unexpected territory, and Eliza found herself confessing, with a vulnerability that surprised her, "I never expected love from marriage. You know, after Geoffrey, I believed such hopes were foolish, that security and respect were the most any sensible woman could ask for, and I made my peace with that. I truly did." She looked down at her hands, unable to meet his eyes as she continued, "I told myself that practical contentment would be enough, that wanting more was simply inviting heartbreak." The silence that followed her words stretched taut as a bowstring, and when she finally gathered the courage to look up, she found him watching her with an expression that stole every thought from her mind. His grey eyes blazed with something fierce and barely contained. His hands gripped the arms of his chair as though he physically restrained himself from moving. And in that moment, she saw clearly the war being waged within him, the desperate struggle between the control that had governed his entire life and something far more powerful that threatened to overwhelm it. "Eliza," he said, and her name in his voice was almost a groan, rough-edged and hungry, and then he was rising abruptly to his feet, his chair scraping against the floor. "I must forgive me, I cannot." He did not finish the sentence, did not explain what he could not do, merely strode from the room with such haste that he nearly upset a side table in his departure, leaving Eliza alone with her racing heart and the absolute certainty that whatever fragile equilibrium had existed between them could not hold much longer, that something was building toward an inevitable conclusion, and though she did not know what form it would take, she knew with every fiber of her being that when it came, it would change everything. The note arrived at midday, delivered by a footman whose face betrayed nothing of its contents, and yet Eliza's hands trembled as she unfolded the paper and read the Duke's elegant script, requesting, not commanding, but requesting that she join him in the rose garden at twilight, and the hours that followed stretched interminably as she tried to occupy herself with needlework and correspondence and all the mundane tasks that usually filled her days. But her mind would not settle, returning again and again to the question of what he might wish to say to her, what could require the setting of the garden at such a particular hour, and when at last the sun began its descent toward the horizon and painted the sky in shades of amber and rose, she made her way through the terrace doors and along the gravel paths until she found him standing among the late-blooming roses, his back to her, his tall figure silhouetted against the fading light, and something in the set of his shoulders tense, almost braced, made her heart constrict with a nameless anticipation. He turned at the sound of her approach, and she saw immediately that the careful mask he wore so habitually was nowhere to be found, his features instead reflecting an inner turmoil she had only glimpsed during her illness, and when he spoke her name, it was with a roughness that seemed to cost him. "Eliza, He stopped, passed a hand over his face in a gesture of frustration she had never witnessed from him, and began again. "I am not skilled at this. At speaking of my father raised me to believe that feeling was weakness, that to express emotion was to invite exploitation, and I learned that lesson well, perhaps too well, but I find." Again he faltered, and she watched him struggle with words as she had never seen him struggle with anything. This man, who commanded rooms with a glance and bent the most powerful men in England to his will, now standing before her unable to complete a sentence, and the sight of it made something bloom fierce and tender in her chest. "I did not marry you for practicality alone," he finally managed, the words emerging as though dragged from some deep place he had long kept sealed. I told myself I did. I convinced myself that it was merely convenient, that you were suitable and nothing more, but it was a lie, I told, to protect myself from a truth I was not ready to face. I noticed you years ago, Eliza, at a ball where you wore a dress the color of spring leaves, and you were kind to a wallflower whom everyone else ignored, and I thought then that I had never seen anyone so beautiful, and I have thought it every day since, and when that worthless fool Geoffrey cast you aside, I wanted to destroy him, not for the insult to society, but because he had wounded you, and I. He drew a shaking breath, his grey eyes bright with something that looked almost like fear. I love you, Eliza. I love you with a depth that terrifies me, because I have never loved anything so much, and if you cannot return the feeling I will understand. I will never speak of it again, but I could not continue in silence when every moment near you is both heaven and torment. But Eliza was already moving toward him, tears streaming freely down her cheeks, and she took his face in her hands and said, Alexander, I love you. I have loved you for longer than I knew. I love you. And when his mouth found hers at last, it was like coming home after a lifetime of wandering, and the roses swayed around them in the evening breeze, as twilight deepened into dusk, and two hearts that had believed themselves incapable of such feeling discovered just how wrong they had been. They walked back through the darkening gardens hand in hand, and Eliza felt as though she were moving through a dream from which she never wished to wake, the warmth of his fingers intertwined with hers more real and more precious than anything she had ever known. And when they entered the house through the terrace doors, the servants seemed to melt away into the shadows as though by some unspoken understanding, leaving them alone in the candle-lit corridor that led to their chambers, and Alexander, for she could think of him now only by his given name, the title and formality, stripped away by the raw truth they had spoken in the garden, drew her gently to a halt outside her door, his grey eyes searching her face with a question he seemed almost afraid to voice, and she answered it by rising on her toes and pressing her lips to his once more. And this time the kiss was not the tender seal of a confession, but something deeper, something hungry, and when he made a low sound against her mouth and gathered her closer, she felt the last of her fears dissolve like morning mist beneath the sun. He lifted her as though she weighed nothing at all, and carried her not to her chamber but to his own, larger and warmer, the fire already burning low in the grate, and when he laid her upon the bed and looked down at her with such reverent wonder, she felt tears prick at her eyes again, not from sorrow but from the overwhelming realization that she was loved, truly and completely loved, by this man whom the world thought incapable of such feeling. And as he lowered himself beside her and traced the curve of her cheek with trembling fingers, she understood that she was witnessing something precious beyond measure. The Stone Duke allowing himself to feel, allowing himself to want, allowing himself to be vulnerable in a way he had never permitted with another living soul. Eliza, he breathed against her throat, her name a prayer upon his lips, and she arched into his touch as his hands learned the contours of her body with a gentleness that made her ache, and when at last they came together fully as husband and wife, she gasped not from pain but from the profound rightness of it, the sense of completion she had never dared believe she would find. And he held her as though she were something infinitely precious, murmuring words of love and devotion against her skin, until the world narrowed to nothing but the two of them and the fire they kindled between them. Afterward they lay tangled together beneath the silken sheets, her head upon his chest where she could hear the steady rhythm of his heart, and they spoke of everything and nothing of the fears that had kept them apart, of the hopes they now dared to harbour, of the future that stretched before them bright with promise, and when she confessed that she had believed herself unworthy of such happiness, he gathered her closer and said with fierce conviction, "You will never doubt my love again. Eliza, I am not skilled with words, but I will spend every day of my life proving to you what you mean to me, and if it takes until my last breath, you will know beyond any question that you are cherished." And she believed him utterly, and as sleep claimed them both, she smiled against his skin, knowing that she had found at last the home her heart had always sought. The months that followed their confession in the rose garden transformed not only the private world within Ashworth Hall, but the very perception of its master throughout all of London society, for the Duke and Duchess of Ashworth had become, by the time the spring season reached its glittering height, the most watched and most admired couple to grace any ballroom, and when they entered the grand assembly at Devonshire House on a warm evening in May, Eliza resplendent in a gown of deep sapphire silk, with the Ashworth diamonds glittering at her throat, her hand resting upon her husband's arm with an ease that spoke of genuine intimacy rather than mere social obligation. The assembled guests fell into whispers, not of scandal or speculation, but of something approaching awe, for here was the Stone Duke, the man whom debutantes had trembled before, and matrons had declared incapable of tender feeling, gazing upon his wife as though she were the only person in the room, his severe features softened by an expression that could only be called devotion, and when he led her onto the dance floor for the opening waltz, his hand at her waist possessive yet gentle, his grey eyes warm with private meaning, those who had known him longest could scarcely credit the transformation they witnessed, though Eliza understood it was not transformation at all but revelation, the uncovering of depths that had always existed beneath the armor he had been taught to wear. And as they moved together in perfect harmony, she caught sight, across the crowded room, of a face she had once believed held power over her happiness. Geoffrey Blackwood stood near the refreshment table, his handsome features now bearing the marks of dissipation and worry, his wife beside him in a gown that spoke of straitened circumstances and a countenance that spoke of misery, for word had spread through society's drawing-rooms that Lord Blackwood's investments had failed spectacularly, that creditors circled like wolves, that his wealthy bride's fortune had proved insufficient to save him from the consequences of his own foolish choices, and though Eliza suspected her husband's quiet influence had played some role in Geoffrey's downfall, she felt no surge of vengeful satisfaction at the sight of him diminished, only a profound peace that seemed to settle over her like a benediction, for she had found a happiness so complete that the memory of his cruelty had lost its sting entirely. And when Geoffrey's eyes met hers across the ballroom, and she saw within them the dawning recognition of what he had so carelessly discarded, she merely inclined her head with gracious dignity before returning her attention to the man who held her in his arms, the man who had shown her what it meant to be truly valued. And as the music swelled and they turned together through the candlelit splendor, she heard the Dowager Countess of Pemberton remark to her companion in carrying tones, "She has tamed the Stone Duke quite remarkable." And Eliza smiled a secret smile against her husband's shoulder, knowing that the old woman had it entirely wrong, for Alexander had never needed taming, only someone patient enough to see past the stone to the tender heart that beat beneath, and when he caught her smile and raised one dark brow in silent question, she merely pressed closer to him as they danced, her heart full to overflowing, with the knowledge that she was loved beyond measure by the man the world had thought incapable of love. 3 years had passed since that twilight confession in the rose garden, 3 years that had transformed Ashworth Hall from a magnificent but cold monument to ducal power into something far more precious, a home filled with warmth and laughter, and the particular chaos that only small children can bring to even the most stately of residences. And on this golden afternoon in late summer, Eliza stood at the tall windows of the morning room, watching her 2 children play among the roses that had witnessed their parents' first declaration of love, little Edward with his father's dark hair and serious grey eyes, chasing his younger sister Charlotte across the manicured lawn, while the girl's delighted shrieks echoed off the ancient stone walls, her copper curls so like Eliza's own bouncing with each tumbling step, and Eliza felt her heart swell with a gratitude so profound it bordered on pain, for she had never dared to dream of such happiness during those dark months when she had believed herself destined for a loveless existence of mere survival, and she was so lost in contemplation of her blessings that she did not hear her husband's approach until his arms slid around her waist from behind, and his lips pressed a tender kiss to her temple, and she leaned back into the solid warmth of him as naturally as breathing, this intimacy between them, now as essential as air, and Alexander's voice rumbled low against her ear as he observed their children's antics with an expression that still had the power to steal her breath, the Stone Duke watching his daughter attempt to catch a butterfly with such soft wonder in his eyes that any stranger witnessing the scene would never have believed the fearsome tales told of him in London's drawing-rooms. "Edward has your determination," he murmured, and she could hear the smile in his voice even before she turned to see it curving his stern mouth. "And Charlotte has inherited your talent for wrapping me entirely around her finger." And Eliza laughed and reached up to touch his face, marveling, as she always did, at the journey that had brought them from that formal, stilted proposal in her father's study to this moment of perfect domestic harmony, and when she said as much aloud, he gathered her closer and pressed his forehead to hers in the gesture of wordless affection that had become uniquely theirs. "I was a fool to think I could keep my heart from you," he admitted quietly. "I believe I loved you from the moment I first saw you across a crowded ballroom, years before I found the courage to approach, and every day since you became my wife, I have thanked Providence for the chance to prove myself worthy of you." And before she could respond that it was she who had been given the gift beyond deserving, Charlotte's imperious voice rang out across the garden demanding that Papa come settle a dispute about who had won their race, and Alexander pressed one last kiss to Eliza's lips before striding out to join his children with an alacrity that would have astonished anyone who remembered only his cold reserve, and Eliza watched through happy tears as he swept Charlotte into his arms and listened with grave attention to her complaints, while Edward tugged at his coat for equal consideration, and when her husband looked back at her with their children clinging to him like small determined vines, his eyes holding all the love he still sometimes struggled to voice, she knew with absolute certainty that she had found a happiness beyond anything she had ever imagined possible. And when at last they walked together toward the house, Alexander carrying a sleepy Charlotte, while Edward held tightly to his mother's hand, they were the very portrait of a family complete, blessed, and bound by a love that had grown from the most unexpected of seeds into something that would endure for all their days. The nursery at Ashworth Hall had been transformed from the austere chamber it had been in Alexander's own childhood, cold and forbidding, presided over by stern nurses, who believed children should be neither seen nor heard, into a warm haven filled with soft light and softer laughter. And it was here that Eliza stood in the doorway on this quiet evening, her heart so full she feared it might overflow as she watched her husband settle into the worn armchair by the fire, with Charlotte already nestled against his chest and Edward perched on the arm beside him, the massive leather-bound book of fairy tales open across Alexander's lap, as his deep voice wove stories of brave knights and clever princesses into the firelit air. And she marveled, as she always did, at the sight of this man whom the world had called cold and unfeeling, now making different voices for each character, his severe features animated with theatrical expressions that sent the children into peals of delighted laughter, and when Charlotte demanded he do the dragon voice again, and Edward insisted the knight needed to be fiercer, Alexander complied with a patience and tenderness that never failed to move her, for she knew how starved he had been for such moments in his own childhood, how his father had never once read to him or held him close, and yet here he was, giving their children everything he had been denied, with a generosity of spirit that spoke to the depth of the man she had been fortunate enough to discover beneath the stone exterior. And when at last the story ended and small eyes grew heavy and nurses came to carry drowsy children to their beds, Alexander pressed kisses to each beloved forehead and whispered promises of more stories tomorrow, and then he rose and came to her in the doorway, his eyes soft with the particular contentment that only these domestic moments seemed to bring him, and he took her hand and led her through the quiet corridors to their private chambers, where a fire burned low, and the great bed they had shared these 3 years waited in welcoming shadow. "I never knew," he said quietly as they stood together by the window, looking out at the moonlit gardens, his arms wrapped around her from behind in the embrace that had become as necessary to her as breathing. "I never believed myself capable of such happiness. My father taught me that love was weakness, that sentiment was to be suppressed, and I believed him for so long that I thought the capacity for feeling had been burned out of me entirely." And Eliza turned in his arms to face him, reaching up to touch the face she loved so dearly, and she told him what she had come to understand across these years of marriage, that his capacity for love had never been destroyed, only buried, waiting for someone patient enough to help him unearth it, and that she thanked Providence every day for the strange path that had led her from heartbreak and humiliation to his side, for without Geoffrey's cruelty she might never have been free to accept Alexander's proposal, might never have discovered that the greatest love of her life had been waiting in the most unexpected of forms, and he kissed her then, with all the passion and reverence that still burned, between them undimmed by time or familiarity, and later as they lay together in the quiet sanctuary of their chambers, her head upon his chest and his hand tracing idle patterns along her spine, she knew with absolute certainty that their love was unshakable, built not upon fleeting passion but upon respect and trust, and the 1,000 daily choices to cherish one another, and the future stretched before them bright with promise and purpose, and the deep, enduring joy of 2 hearts that had found their home in each other. And so it was that Lady Eliza Ashford, once the object of society's pity, the woman passed over and whispered about in shadowed corners of ballrooms, found herself living a life so richly blessed that there were moments she still could scarcely believe it was truly hers. For she had learned in the years since that fateful proposal that love was not always the thunderbolt the poets described, not always the instant recognition of souls that romantic novels promised, but rather something that could grow slowly and steadily from the most unpromising of soil, nurtured by respect and kindness, and the daily choice to see another person truly and to let oneself be seen in return. And she had learned, too, that actions spoke with a voice far louder than words ever could, that a man who remembered the small things, a favorite flower, a beloved book, a preference for morning light in one's sitting room, was demonstrating a devotion more profound than any flowery declaration, and that finding happiness sometimes required the courage to release old wounds and trust again, when every instinct screamed for self-protection. And as she stood now on the terrace of Ashworth Hall, watching the sun descend toward the horizon in a blaze of gold and crimson, painting the sky in colors that seemed borrowed from heaven itself, she felt Alexander's hand find hers as it always did, their fingers intertwining with the ease of long familiarity and the enduring spark of passion that had never dimmed between them. And she thought of all the paths that had led them to this moment, her heartbreak at Geoffrey's cruelty, her resigned acceptance of a practical match, those early weeks of cautious discovery, the slow blooming of affection into love, and she understood at last that every trial had been leading her here, to this man who would fight the world for her, and who had proven his devotion not in grand gestures alone, but in 1,000 quiet moments of tenderness. And when he lifted her hand to his lips, as he so often did, pressing a kiss to her fingers with eyes that held the same reverence they had held on their wedding night and every night since, she knew with perfect certainty that she was exactly where she was always meant to be. And if you who have traveled this journey alongside her have found something of yourself in her story, in her wounds and her hopes and her courage to believe again, then know that such love exists not only in tales, but waits in the world for those brave enough to recognize it, even when it arrives in unexpected forms, for the heart knows its home when it finds it, and Eliza's heart had found its home in a man the world called cold, but whom she knew to be the warmest of souls. And as the last light of day gilded the gardens where their children had played, and where they themselves had first declared their love, the Duke and Duchess of Ashworth stood together, as they would stand for all the years to come, hands intertwined, hearts full, blessed beyond measure, and grateful beyond words for the love that had transformed them both.